management district, but if you remember correctly, he showed up at the water management district to crow about it, to crow about all the people he was firing. It was a terrible, terrible thing, and hopefully he has learned his lesson. I mean, that was just not only was it insensitive to all the people who worked there, but it was bad policy, and we're suffering for it. So, having said that, you know, I think we're going to work in a bipartisan way this year to try to get some good things done on these issues. We don't really have a choice. We're in a crisis as it relates to water in South Florida, and it's not going to get any better if we don't take it seriously. So I'm glad to work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, because I think we've all come to the conclusion that something needs to be done here, and it's only a matter of time until we ruin what we have if we don't take it seriously now. And I'm going to apologize to everybody. I've got to go take my kids to school, and I appreciate you having me. So.
Senator Abruzzo just joined us. Joe, if you want to say a couple of things about your district.
Sure, thank you very much. And Senator Clemens leaves, so I'm taking over for him. I'll take his spot. I'm Joseph Abruzzo. I have the privilege of being your senator right here in Palm Beach Gardens. I primarily represent the entire county west of the Turnpike, and then it cuts over east, right where we're sitting this morning, all the way to the ocean, Juneau, Jupiter, and part of North Palm. I apologize, I missed some of these very important questions. We have them up here, and I just want to let you know I walked in late because I had a important meeting with community leaders that's been on the books for some time. That said, I would like to address the last question that was asked, water quality. I'm fortunate enough to serve as the Vice Chairman of Environmental Preservation in the Senate. And I know the governor's budget was recently rolled out, $74 billion budget. In that budget, there's a $40 million appropriation to a stormwater treatment facility in Lake Okeechobee. Good step, I would say, but not nearly enough. From what we've looked at through my office, there's about $130 million appropriated to water quality. And again, that's a little below what I would think is sufficient, the challenges we have ahead. That said, the governor, although it is his budget, you know, the Senate and the House are far from completing their task, and the governor generally, the governor's budget doesn't always work out the way that the executive branch hopes. So I know we are going to be fighting very hard for water quality throughout the state of Florida, but specifically for right here in Palm Beach County and Lake Okeechobee. And I do concur with Senator Clemens in the serious cuts that were delivered to our water management districts here, our South Florida Water Management District. And we need to really take a look at that agency and how it's operating and where they need. And I know Leader Pafford and the rest of the delegation are going to be fighting very hard for us here. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to jump to another question. Deregulation of professions. Do you think there's going to be another effort this session to deregulate certain professions? And if so, is that something you would support, and why?
I'll jump in here. I know we had an attempt a couple years ago to really look at this. At the time, now Senator Dorothy Uckel ran this in the House, and it ran into a lot of issues, especially over in the Senate. My general position on deregulation, from a Republican standpoint, I'm generally for deregulation, but I only want deregulation if that particular group wants to be deregulated. That was, I think, the issue that we found the time we tried to do this a couple of years ago, is that we started hearing from a bunch of groups that did not want to be deregulated, and they were lumped in with other groups that did, and that bogged that bill down from my memory of it. So I'm kind of one of these people that if the group does not want to be deregulated for whatever reason, I'm fine with them allowing themselves to regulate themselves. So that's just my own personal opinion.
I would not support deregulation. And what I can tell you is that last year, the bill was filed again in both the House and the Senate, and it didn't go anywhere. So I'm going to go out on a limb and guess this year that if the bill is filed, considering that for the most part, they're the same chairs of the committees, it probably won't get a hearing. But in terms of overall deregulation, I know there were barbers, different professions that were looked into that. The architect spoke out against it, and I would say that I would not support deregulation.
Senator Abruzzo.
Thank you. Likewise, I concur with Representative Powell. Representative Rooney said it right. It was when all these deregulation bills have been filed over the past 3 years, they've been lumped in all together. And I'll give you one horrific example. In the bill, they wanted to deregulate auto mechanics. So somebody could work on your car, and then you could go barreling 75, 80 miles an hour down the turnpike by somebody that wasn't regulated that worked on your car. So serious safety issues on many of the different professions in it, and I also would not support deregulation. I also agree, I don't believe it will go anywhere this year, but rest assured, probably most years you will see some form of deregulation will follow.
And I would agree with Representative Rooney. The question is rather broad. There are so many instances over the next 60 days during session that deregulation or regulation is going to come up, and every case is going to be different. I've already been on record in terms of voting against the dereg, a few years ago. But what we need to also do is take pause here, and it was inferred, but we need to say it. Just because there's an idea coming from the administration, what you're looking at up here, and folks like Senator Negron, the legislature actually works, I think, 90% of the time in a very bipartisan manner. There are tremendous skill sets that come from this delegation, whether it be any member up here, Republican or Democrat, or any member that isn't here this morning. And so it's critical to understand that, because the legislature does play a heavy role if you are in contact with whoever represents you, Republican or Democrat, and you make it known how you feel as an individual. It does happen more often than not in the legislature that we work in a very bipartisan way. And on issues like this, where it's really important, we understand what deregulating a certain industry is going to do to those folks out there who have gone to school for years to do a particular thing. The example for me is a guy named Charles Van Zandt. Charles Van Zandt, by the way, he is related to the band guy, Van Zandt. You wouldn't know it. Yeah, he is. He's a cousin. He met him like at 10 years old. Anyway, at a band competition, he lost. But Charles is one of the most conservative members of the legislature. I don't agree with him on a lot of things. On this one, we worked with Charles. I think he's an interior designer. I think that's the area of profession. And so that does happen. So just be aware, a lot of the stuff you hear and see doesn't always mean something if you've got members that show up at 7 a.m. with or without a tie.
And a somewhat related question on additional professional development requirements for engineers. Senate Bill 692 has been filed, and it calls for professional engineers to complete 20 professional development hours for license renewal per 2-year cycle, instead of the current requirement of 8 hours per 2-year cycle. Do you have an opinion on this requirement? Do you expect to be supporting the bill?
What I can tell you is, for somebody who has to maintain their certification credits, I'm not an engineer, so as the language from the bill comes out, I would support whatever the engineers support if they want to decrease the number of hours. However, I think the fact is, with continuing education, it's an opportunity for everybody who's involved in a profession to continue to hone their craft and kind of build on their skills. For us, I think I have to maintain 32 hours every 2 years. And by doing that, it gives me an opportunity, although still working in the field, it gives me an opportunity to see things that I don't see within our field. It gives us an opportunity to look at things. You talked earlier about economic gardening, but community gardens and different ideas within the planning profession that I don't look at on an everyday basis, because planning is a broad field. So in terms of engineering, as I'm not an engineer, I would think that the amount of credits required are useful. However, as the language comes out and as the Engineering Society speaks, I would be willing to look to people to give us more information, such as Jason Matson over here, who's going to be up there in Tallahassee with us next week. So, thank you.
This is one of those issues that I think Representative Pafford was talking about. I'm not really familiar with this, but this is something we would listen, Republican or Democrat, we would listen to you to tell us if you're for or against something like this. This is a very specific bill. Another thing, just for sort of a government 101, there's a Senate bill here, but I asked Representative Pafford if he knew if there was a House bill. It's very key. If there's no House bill, there's no chance that this is going to actually pass. House members only have 6 bills that we're allowed to pass or to offer to become bills. So we have to be very careful about what we choose to pick or not. Senators and Senator Abruzzo can tell you, being a former member of the House, it's a lot nicer being a senator because they don't have a limit. They can propose as many bills as they want. That's where I think you heard Senator Clemens when he brought that bill about the ethics for. He doesn't have to think too much about that. He can file it for them and then see kind of what the reaction might be. But in this case, if there isn't a House component, this isn't going anywhere. So
that may cut both ways, Senator Abruzzo. Is it really that great being able to file unlimited bills? I love telling people, wow, Bill wants to fill it up. It's pretty good. I aspire to that one day. I'm always curious when I wake up and I see a bill file that says engineers have to do 20 hours instead of 8 hours. I don't know if that's a platform that someone runs their re-election campaign on. I don't know where these bills emanate from. Sometimes I get very skeptical because I know that there's a profit motive sometimes involved with continuing education. I face that as an attorney. I don't know how many hours we do a year, but it's a lot and it costs a lot of money. And so when we talk about regulation and increasing the hours that you need to maintain your certification, that really has to come from the practicing professionals and not necessarily from the lobby group that is protecting them. So if you see something, you're asking 160 people, 99% of which aren't engineers or planners or anything to that effect. When we hear directly from our constituency about, hey, we really don't need this, or yes, there are demonstrated reasons why we need to up it to 20 hours, I would think that most legislators would be very responsive to that.
And real quick, just to piggyback off of what Representative Kerner said, prior to my graduation from urban planning school and becoming AICP certified, AICP did not have certification maintenance credits. That's something that happened recently. And I always figured it was only happening because I was becoming AICP. But it's now my understanding that that may not be the case.
Okay. I'm going to ask 2 more questions from our prepared set of questions, and then we're going to take questions from the floor. So if any of you all have questions, you might want to start thinking about what they are and be prepared to head one of the microphones. This next one is on property rights. While Florida has some of the strongest property rights laws in the country, the House currently has a property rights bill, House Bill 395, that would require local governments to create a new property rights element in all local comprehensive plans. Do you feel that such a bill is necessary, particularly given existing laws such as the Byrd-Harris Act? And do you think a bill like this is likely to pass the legislature? Does anybody want to take a stab at that question?
Well, Susan, since you asked the question, I'm glad you asked that question. I pulled the bill up. In terms of property rights and the state government, a few years ago, the state came up with this idea to allow local governments to have home rule. Pretty much gave everything back to local government with the 2011 Growth Management Act. Anytime, and like I said, I pulled it, I haven't read it in detail yet, but anytime the state starts to try to make the local government do something that they originally took back from the state and gave back to the local governments, my initial reaction is I'm generally skeptical of it, but time will tell. At this point, I really don't think it's a good idea that the state mandate that local governments put something into their comprehensive plans. Because at one point the state decided, hey, local governments, you have your comprehensive plan and we're going to allow you to have certain elements in them, and it's now home rule. Now when it comes to property rights, we're going to say that's you're mandated to do something else. I just don't think at a state level we should be putting more mandates back on the local government and say you have home rule.
Anybody else? Okay. All right. I'm going to ask a question about sunshine law. Best practices for public engagement strive to invite more informed input from residents and interested parties, not less. There was a recent case, Finch versus the Seminole County School Board, in which the members of the school board took a bus tour of neighborhoods that would be affected by a rezoning action. And it was found that that particular bus tour actually violated the sunshine law. Regretfully, that particular action then in turn caused a St. Lucie County Advisory Committee that had no rezoning authority to cancel a trolley tour of the Fort Pierce Seaport in December of this past year. Do you think the legislature is likely to consider any revisions to the sunshine law that would address potential rebalancing of the law's reach versus what folks would consider to be good and desirable public engagement?
Let me start by saying the Sunshine Law and the Public Records Law as well that complements the Sunshine Law is an excellent law. It's really a powerful tool for constituents and for government officials. We can get a lot of documents through the power of the pen, as can you. But there are some flaws in the system, and last year, let me set the stage. In Palm Beach County, there is an organization called the Criminal Justice Commission of Palm Beach County. And in a county of 1.2 million people, it's very important to get all the criminal justice partners at the table together. It's created by ordinance. It consists of some Palm Beach County commissioners, the sheriff, the state attorney, the public defender, the chief judge, various chiefs of police, and members of the Palm Beach Economic Council. And I sit on that board, and every month we get together and we talk about how to better address collectively the issues of criminal justice in our county. Because of the Sunshine Law, the sheriff, the state attorney, the chief judge, the public defender, and the various other elected officials weren't allowed to talk to each other. They weren't allowed to discuss private information about ongoing criminal investigations. So that is merely by the mechanism of law. If they sit on that commission, they cannot talk to each other unless they notice it. It's in the public, and everyone has the right to attend. Now, what kind of public policy is that? So, Senator Abruzzo and I filed a bill. It worked its way through the legislature, and just so you know, as a result of the Sunshine Law, they refused to sit on the Criminal Justice Commission. So now we have members of the Palm Beach Economic Council and me sitting in a room together, and we don't have the judges and the sheriff and the state attorney because they left the commission. So we filed a bill to exempt them. We took a lot of heat because anytime you try to restrict access, it's not looked favorably upon by the press. But it passed and was signed into law. Now those members sit and we can do the business of the people. And I have another bill that I filed this year, and it deals with the sunshine exemptions for the presidential searches of universities. Probably the most unpopular bill that I've seen. Four newspapers have done editorials against the bill, but look at the public policy. We're building a world-class university system here in Florida. We devote so many resources to it. But when we ask for those presidential applicants to apply, the moment they apply, their name is put in the sunshine. Their application's exposed, then they are immediately burned at the current institution of higher learning. 25 states have exempted that. So we're competing now nationally to recruit the top talent for our university system. But people are refusing to apply here because they know the moment that they do, they will be burned. That's not a great way to attract the largest and most qualified applicant. Now I admit, it's a controversial bill. What the bill does is it shades the initial round of applicants. If they move to the final selection process, the Sunshine Law does kick in. But why not encourage the largest applicant pool and the most qualified applicant pool? We're not competing just with folks in Florida. We're asking university presidents and deans from other states to apply here in Florida. And 25 other states have already recognized that we're on a national playing field, and they've exempted those searches from the Sunshine Law. I think overall we need to find a balance, but don't assume that because the legislator is trying to amend the Sunshine Law that it's a secret endeavor, that they're trying to get something over on the public. We would not raise taxes 1 cent, and we would broaden our applicant pool exponentially. It's passed the first committee, by the way, and we have Senator Hayes in the Senate that sponsored it. So there's a good chance that it could pass. I think it would be real good for the university system.
Anybody else?
I'll just echo what Representative Kerner said. I think a couple things. I think it relates a little bit back to the gift ban. There's an action, then there's a reaction from the legislature. Obviously, there are most things that need to be said in the public, and I'm completely for that transparency. I'll relate, going back to my days on the Water Management Governing Board, we were under strict Sunshine Law. You couldn't send anybody else on that board a Christmas card. The only time I really talked to anybody else on that board was on the dais when we met once a month. As legislators, we have a little bit more leeway in what we can say to each other, but we're still governed by the Sunshine Law. I think it relates back to what Representative Kerner said, though. When you're in these positions, being public officials, you almost get paranoid about, again, what you're eating, if someone offers you something, and then especially who you're talking to, you're just always on alert that, okay, I don't want a gift ban violation, I don't want a Sunshine Law violation, and I don't know if that detracts completely from qualified people wanting to do these jobs, but I think it does play a factor with some folks, so they just don't want to get involved because they're afraid that they're going to get nailed on something, and that's really not what we want. So I think, as Representative Kerner said, a balance is really, what we need here, and to find that happy medium of what we can talk about legitimately and what needs to be open to the public, I think is going to be an ongoing process.
Can I make a word?
Yes.
This is an extreme example, but the Sunshine Law allows the victims of human trafficking and sexual violence, it allows their addresses to be exposed. It allows safe houses that are created by the legislature where victims will go. It allows that address to be exposed. We need to think very carefully about what kind of public policy that is, because the property appraiser in the clerk's office has to list that. We now put someone in a safe house, and you can go on your iPhone and find out where that safe house is within minutes. We, as legislators, this should always be open to the public. You can do a public records request on my email at any time. You will see a lot of general bantering between me and my staff, but we expose ourselves to that when we become elected. But we have to taper the Sunshine Law to make sure that we're still allowing good policies to move forward. One of my largest efforts this session, people think I try to do violence to the Sunshine Law every session. I really don't. But one of my biggest efforts will be to restrict the personal information, contact information, and addresses of folks that are in traffic crashes. Why? Because every month, some large corporation does a public records request, gets all the information of every person in a crash. They then sell that information to runners, unethical attorneys, and unsavory doctors and chiropractors, and they solicit these folks. I mean, I see it happen in my profession all the time. But the moment I follow that bill, I'm a bad guy because I'm trying to restrict access to public records. I guarantee you, if we enacted that one reform, we talk about PIP reform and PIP fraud, that one statute would decrease the amount of PIP fraud that occurs in the state by billions of dollars. And I have the Palm Beach Economic Council supporting it, I have the Florida Sheriff's Association supporting it. You have to get creative with these laws sometimes, and while still protecting the overall goal of public access to government.
Does anyone from the floor have a question? I have some more questions, but if you don't, Tom.